All right, guys. Today we're going to cover the American Revolution. This one might go a little bit longer, maybe 15 minutes, but I'll try to keep it as brief as possible here. Spain had the majority of the hemisphere prior to the Treaty of Tordesillas, and the only country that really listened to that was Portugal. Everyone else basically said, "Yeah, whatever." So in comes the British, and the British eventually break into 13 colonies, which you all know and are well aware of. But that's why we're going to go through this pretty quick. The population of the colonies was about 1.5 million people. Their government consisted of a parliament plus the colony legislatures. When it says that they had a parliament, it was just the British parliament that sent their laws to the colonies. There wasn't a separate parliament in the colonies. They just had their own legislatures there, so they each had their own state government as well. Then comes the 7 Years' War. Britain and France from 1756 to 1763. This was essentially World War .5. It wasn't quite as large scale as World War I or World War II, but it was fought in Europe, the Americas, Africa, India, and the Philippines. In the U.S., we tend to call it the French and Indian War, which is what you might have learned it as whenever you were probably in middle school. This was a fight over the Ohio River Valley, which essentially is where the Great Lakes kind of are. When all is said and done, Britain ends up gaining all of New France, which is all of Canada, and Florida from Spain. And in return, Spain gets Louisiana, but then Napoleon takes it back a couple years later. So doesn't matter for too long. The British Empire fought a war to defend the 13 colonies from the evil French Empire. And war is the most expensive thing you can do. So who pays for it? The answer? You do, colonies. You do. So thus comes in the main reason why the actual, we'll say, revolution really happens, is that there was a massive amount of taxation without representation. And that is the defining reason why the revolution occurred. The colonists sent Ben Franklin over to England for him to essentially say, hey, we got a problem here. He complains about all the new taxes, especially the stamp tax, which required a stamp on all goods to prove that they were British manufactured and made. So literally it was just like, oh, yeah, this is good. And it cost money to get that verified. And you couldn't buy anything without a stamp on it. So think like the FDA labels and stuff like that on food, or really just any sort of receipt almost. So he gets there and he says, hey, the Stamp Act is messed up, right? So the direct tax on paper was required to carry the stamp. So hooray, there you go. The Stamp Act gets repealed in 1766 because whenever Franklin gets there, essentially Parliament agrees. Not necessarily about the amount, because it was a low amount, but it's on the principle itself that the colonies didn't feel like they should get taxed without having some input on the tax. So Parliament agrees, right, which is kind of good for the colonies, but more taxes are here to follow. So every law the people have not ratified in person is not a law. This is going to be Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who go ahead and says this. He's one of the thinkers that you should have looked at yesterday. And he basically says if the people themselves are not consenting to the laws that are being made, then it's not a law. So the colonies strike back. In 1765, the Sons of Liberty form a group that is opposed to the new laws. There you go. They found themselves in Massachusetts, and they have protests and violence to make sure that the British couldn't collect these new taxes that they made. Actions ultimately lead to the Stamp Act Congress, and 9 colonies meet to take action. They all lead to a boycott of British goods, all of them, every single thing that is British made. The Stamp Act gets repealed, and they essentially go, okay, good enough. But then comes the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts was a tax on many goods like tea, paper, glass, and all of it was exclusively had to be British bought. The colonists again boycotted, and in return, The British actually send in troops and they're like, you need to buy our stuff. Stop trying to make your own things. Um, which sounds pretty ridiculous, but if you think back to the way in which we played the mercantilism game, Britain can be pretty ridiculous. So along comes our good old buddy Sam Adams, and John Hancock, Patrick Henry, and Mulligan and Revere. Those are going to be the key people that are part of the Sons of Liberty. So the tilting point to everything and kind of the start off of when things start going downhill is the Boston Massacre. Troops clash with protesters and snowballs and rocks are thrown. And in return, the British troops open fire with guns, hitting 11 and killing 5. So one way to up the ante. This would become the rallying cry for all protests against Britain. They basically would say, look how horrible and awful they are in every way. Oh, why then a British ship ends up getting burned in 1772. Then the British tea shipment gets destroyed in 1773 in the famous event where they dump all the tea into the water. This was about $500,000 of tea in that day's currency. So reflected on normal, like modern day currency, we're talking millions and millions of dollars of shipment here was destroyed. And this would lead to Lexington and Concord. So Lexington and Concord is the first real fight. The British response was the Intolerable Acts, where Boston Harbor is closed until they're repaid for all of the tea that was lost. No town meetings are allowed, and British troops are quartered in homes. So literally, troops just come in and stay in people's houses. Massachusetts is declared in rebellion, so British troops are allowed to disarm all rebels, and patriots are expelled and royal officials from the colony. Patriots, sorry, I just read that one, double typed. Lexington and Concord is the first military engagement. The war was officially on, right? So this is the first organized, both sides met, both sides were ready to fight. King George III declared all the colonies in rebellion after this and would ultimately lead to the formal declaration of war. So then comes the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration is the Enlightenment document. It is the most important document of all of the Enlightenment thinkers because it's basically all of their thoughts wrapped up into one, which is what I was hoping you got at yesterday. In May 1776, all the states begin to write their own constitutions, and then ultimately, in July, they unanimously decide to declare independence, and Jefferson is appointed draft copy. Jefferson even states himself there was nothing original in the Declaration. He just took other people's thoughts and put them all together. So there you got your famous picture. It is the most potent and consequential lines in American history. So there you go.
The Declaration of Independence, for me, is one of the best pieces of writing I've ever seen.
It's a revolutionary document for a revolutionary statement.
You cannot help but be stirred when you read those words.
Thomas Jefferson's writing is absolutely magnificent. And when he wrote, "Behold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." That was the first time anybody had bothered to write that down.
And then you turn the clock back and think of when he was writing, how young he was, what a statement it was given the history of the world at that point. And you feel the excitement of being on the cusp of something so profound that it's hard to put it into words.
If you review our Declaration of Independence, it has those beautiful words about all men are created equal and governments are formed among men to represent the people. It's a good statement of what we were all about. And that's the only thing people remember about the Declaration of Independence, that it was about all men are created equal. But it's really roughly a 28 count indictment against King George. And therefore, because of the way in which the British Crown treated us, we now declare that we are a free country, and we want to let you know why. Now, if we're going to have a war, we're going to have a war.
In 1776, you have the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia, debating a unified position for the colonies with respect to the hostilities that have already broken out. And the fundamental issue between them is, are they fighting for their rights as Englishmen within the British Empire, or are they going to fight for independence? And they're seriously divided. People who are perfectly willing to resist the tyranny of the British government are not necessarily willing to strike for independence. But there's a groundswell in favor of it, I think, in large measure because they recognize that having provoked the lion this far, there's no going back.
All of a sudden, you have this group of people who are going, no, we're not part of some great chain of being with the king at the top of it. We are free people. We can vote for who we want to have in charge. And we're not going to tolerate you telling us that we have some class status we have to be trapped in. It says, you know, we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, meaning that Parliament in London, the King himself, the courts cannot interfere and take away your rights because the state can't take power from us. Even to this day, it's probably the most central difference between America and every other country in the world.
It goes well beyond what was needed in order to declare independence. It establishes a philosophical basis for a civil democracy in which all persons are guaranteed rights by virtue of their personhood.
This political genius, not just in Jefferson, but in Adams and all the other people who collected here, they saw a new time for humankind, which is that we can be free and that we can make decisions for ourselves.
Yeah. So King George did not take kindly to their previous statement. So thus the Revolutionary War happens. The British amass their forces in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Negotiations are attempted. They wanted a retraction of the Declaration, but that was kind of a deal breaker. The British seize New York City. They take control of New Jersey. And ultimately, Washington ends up sneaking across the Delaware and defeats the Hessians. So there you go. You got your famous picture there too. Right? Great Britain will end up losing the Battle of Saratoga, and that is the turning point to the war. Great Britain loses a major battle, and it shows that the United States can actually be competent in a fight. The Allies start lining up to help after that. That's when Spain, France, and the Dutch all offer to help us. And the reason they do that is because they all hate Britain. Right? So ultimately, it all leads to the Battle of Yorktown, which is where they surrender, and it leads to the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763. So Yorktown is won. Hooray! So, the Constitution. The government formed under the Articles of Confederation, which was a terrible government. It had no taxes, it had no currency, no president, no judicial branch at all, and the Constitutional Convention was called to rewrite these articles. They scrapped the whole thing, and a new constitution ends up going into effect March 4th, 1789. They brought together all of the influences from the Enlightenment. Locke with his natural rights, Rousseau with the social contract, Montesquieu with the separation of powers. And if you ever watch the movie Hamilton, you know that a couple of these people are going to play a major role. So there's Washington. There's Lafayette. There's Hamilton. And there's Rochambeau. Right? So there's the French flag, which ironically looks a lot like a surrender flag. So the real question then is, how much does independence cost? Cost of the Revolution in England was 250 million pounds, which is quite a bit. So the way that they tried to collect all that debt was by taxing their entire empire. For the colonies, they took out loans from France, Spain, and the Netherlands, and $37 million of it comes from the federal government. $114 million comes from the states. They create a national bank thanks to Hamilton and create a line of credit. They sell bonds and create a national currency, which is where we get the dollar. But then there's France, which is 3.5 billion livres. It's 1.3 billion from the American Revolution and the rest from the 7 Years' War, 10 times their national income. So whenever you look at the money that they spent, France lost the most by a mile. The Estates General essentially have to collect all their debt, and the debt becomes 63% of their entire GDP. By 1795, inflation was 3,500%. And Louis called the Estates General, which leads to the French Revolution, and that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow. All right, have a good one, guys.